Sure, you all enjoyed that session with Klaus Leitenberger. Some brilliant questions, and I could have listened to him speak all day. But unfortunately, we have to move on. Time's ticking. So fantastic to welcome Nicole Masters from New Zealand. Nicole is an independent agroecologist, systems thinker, and educator. She's recognised as a knowledgeable and dynamic speaker on the topic of soil health and supports farmers in taking their operations to the next level in nutrient density, profitability, and environmental outcomes. She's one of a growing number of people who are facilitating a rapidly expanding world of quality food production and biological economies. Nicole, fantastic to speak. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. And what a lineup you guys have managed to score. That is absolutely fantastic. I'm speaking to you right now from snowy Montana. So yes, I'm a New Zealander, but actually increasingly I have been spending my time here in the US. And with COVID, I've actually just stopped moving about at all. So yeah, what I'd like this presentation to dig into is just thinking about some of these transitions, and I just kind of want to share some different case studies in terms of what is possible and the different approaches that people are taking. So you can see this? Yeah? Very good. And if you haven't already got a copy of my book, it's called For the Love of Soil, and I really recommend you grab a copy of that. So there's probably been other speakers talking about regenerative farming or defining regenerative farming. The point I want to get across is that actually so much of this is about a complex learning system. And it's not about, I'm going to substitute this or I'm going to add in this, or there's some kind of silver bullet that I can just mix in the system and hey, presto, I'm regenerative. It's really looking for what is it that works well in this local context. And I think you've had some great conversations about that. And if we look at agroecology and regenerative agriculture, it is really the farmers that are the experts. And what I'm increasingly seeing is research groups and scientists approaching farmers and approaching the people on the ground to really try and glean information from what people are doing. So a big part of this is, and what forms the bottom of this pyramid in terms of having a successful regenerative system, is doing things like these kind of events, so listening in and tuning into conferences or workshops or whatever you can do to learn, listening to audiobooks or podcasts, and then combining that with your observations. So really starting to tune into what am I seeing, what does it mean, before we start even taking any action. And now management is the next step to this. It is not some kind of product that you can just buy in a bag. So, people will talk about different approaches, but at the end of the day, if you're not managing well, which is fine, there are people that don't manage very well and are still building soil health, it's going to cost you a lot more. Like you're going to have to put in more inputs, spend more money, whatever it looks like, if you're not willing to kind of take on the management. And what underpins all of this is your mindset. And I'm sure Gabe Brown probably referred to that paddock between your ears. That is what drives the success or the not success, is your ability to really step outside your comfort zone and try new things, be willing to maybe be a little bit uncertain, and that's a really challenging thing for a lot of people. So I want to share this example. So this operation is called River Sun Nurseries. They do about between 3 to 5 million rootstock a year. So they're the biggest rootstock producers in New Zealand. And one of their visions is to have 1,000-year sustainability. And they look at it through these different lenses of asking the why questions. So take this practice, for instance. So when I arrived, what they were doing was laying black plastic on these furrows. And the reason for that is it's going to suppress weeds, and it's also going to make these soils warm up faster, which is great, right? And then because they've got the black plastic, they also need to put irrigation tape underneath these rootstock rows. Now, that ends up costing them an awful lot of money, and then they have all of this waste at the end of the year. And so they're like, well, if it's a 1,000-year sustainability vision, this doesn't fit. And so we ask the why questions of why do we do this, and why and why and why. And we asked that about 6 times until we got to That's just because that's what the industry does. So instead, what they decided to do was roll out barley straw. So using barley straw as an organic mulch instead of the black plastic. By doing that, they no longer needed the irrigation tape. We saw substantial lifts in soil health, aggregation, earthworms, all of these other things. And what was super interesting is when they costed it out at the end of the year, even including all the labor and the cost of the barley straw, it was cheaper to use that organic mulch than it was to do this. Now, they did have a few problems, like the first year the barley sprouted, but instead of seeing that as like having a huge failure, they went, okay, we need to have sterilized barley. So they actually ended up sterilizing it. And right now, I believe they're actually looking into geotextile fibers. So they're still advancing what's possible, but it's through this willingness to ask these why questions and not just go, well, that's how we've always done it. So one of the things that I think is really important is looking at what is it that is putting a drag on your system, or what is it that we really need to focus on. So I talk about the 5 M's. So 1 being your mindset, 2 being your management, your minerals or your microbes or organic matter. Kind of cheating with the 5 M's, it's fine. And so these 5 things come together to have that outcome of good soil health. And so when someone comes in and they might say, hey, you need this kind of microbial, if you have a look at your own soil system and go, well, actually my microbes are working really well, I have a major mineral imbalance. Or actually those 2 things are working well, I have no organic matter. Or I just don't think it's possible, and so therefore it's not possible because your mindset's just not in the right place. So really drawing on these 5 M's can give us insights into where to take action. And so we can do that through doing mineral or microbial testing, our leaf tissue or sap testing, taking field observations, digging holes. Please, can you guys dig some more holes and really have a look at, is water moving through that system? How deep are your roots going? And keeping records of it. And part of that, I think, ties into what I call the smug test, in terms of if you keep records, you can really say, hey, it used to take 45 minutes for an inch of water to infiltrate, and now it's taking 45 seconds. And then you can feel really good about what you're achieving. Or, doing comparisons. Hopefully you have neighbors that are willing for you to compare across the fence. I used to have a neighbor, and they were running on a 10-acre block. No, it was smaller than that. 2-acre block. They were running like 40 pet sheep, and they had 2 fields that they would alternate from. So you can kind of imagine potentially what they look like. And so they were great neighbors because they let me jump the fence and compare our soil temperature. And we would see that we were significantly warmer early in spring and significantly cooler in the middle of the heat of summer. And that really helped us to realize what great leaps we were taking forward. And taking that time to self-reflect, all right? If mindset is what's holding you back, and sometimes the best people to ask is your husband or your wife. They're going to tell you what your mindset drag might be. All right, and then we want to identify what are those limits or enabling factors to success. So the first place to look at is my plant capturing optimal sunlight energy? And particularly in countries like New Zealand and Ireland, where we have a lot of cloudy days, how well is that plant capturing sunlight energy? Because, and I'm sure Christine Jones touched on this, is we need to be pumping those sugars out the root system. We need to be building stable carbon. We need to be feeding microbiology. And if that part of the system isn't working, then aggregation won't be working, feeding diverse microbiology won't be working, and we end up then with airflow issues. So have a look. Have you got beautiful structured soil, or is your soil really compacted? And if you're anything like New Zealand, because I haven't been to Ireland, even though I should, my mum has an Irish passport, and I'd love to come once COVID's over, but if those soils are compacted and they're not breathing, then that's your number 1 place to start. Hey, you might look at your soil and go, well, it looks quite aerated, but when we do a water infiltration test, the water's not going in. All right, number 1 place. The next place for you to start looking is what's happening with water, then what's happening with decomposition, and then look, do we have some kind of drag on that system in terms of macro or micro elements? But those first 4 are really your management and above ground. What are you doing in terms of supporting plant health? And that is what's going to drive building aggregation and below ground. So management really is your number 1 tool. This photo was taken in 2000 and 2010, New Zealand had a pretty significant drought, and I hate saying drought to most audiences, but I think in Ireland you'll get it. You know, we have very shallow rooting systems. New Zealand soils dry up very quickly because it's a temperate rain-fed environment, and these plants just expect that someone's going to water them. So this photo was taken at the same time as this, all right, and they're both from the Hawke's Bay. Is that it's your management that gives you a buffer to things like drought, or is what's building that soil sponge so you can hold on to water so you're not getting waterlogged as fast. So they actually did a study looking at these different farmers who were practicing adaptive grazing management or holistic management, and discovered that these guys, while their neighbors back here were feeding out in early November, so that's during our summer period, these guys didn't start looking at feed deficits until the end of March. And by then they actually got a rainfall event, so they didn't have to feed out. But you see how green it is in that base. Those animals have adequate grass. But really, this is how we're building for resilience, is we're thinking long term. And what's interesting for me here in Montana is many of the ranchers talk about their grandfathers saying they needed to have 2 or 3 years of forage ahead of them, because the droughts, when they hit here, will obviously be quite significant. So in terms of adaptive grazing management, you guys can make massive, massive steps and build soil very, very quickly. So in the image above, this is literally one of those flirts. Now this flirt, if you notice the animals in the middle, so we've got sheep and cattle in there, but this guy was also bunched up as deer. In the end of this, I think his take-home message was maybe this wasn't a good idea. But he sent me a photograph because he was panicking, because he said his soil was bleeding. And if you look at the image below, you see that lovely dark topsoil. And these are on pumice soil, so very light. But those dark lines started to form after he started to get impact of manure and urine and trampling all of that leaf material. It sent certain organisms into overdrive. And one of them was a worm called Apodictia longa, or the blackhead worm, which is an English worm. I imagine you have it in Ireland. And these black lines, or the bleeding, was worm castings. So these worms actually lay castings in their burrow. You can build soil incredibly, incredibly quickly to far greater depths than what is expected. So in New Zealand, they say, oh, we already have very, very high organic matter. You can't do anything about it. But they're only measuring that very top part of the soil. Actually, we can build carbon all the way down through that profile. So I want to share this example, and it is from a vineyard. And I know that some of you are from, like you might be cropping or you're running livestock or whatever. It doesn't matter. These principles are the same no matter where we are. And so this particular vineyard had a very long history of cropping. They've been growing potatoes before they put the vineyard in. Huge amounts of herbicide-resistant weeds, huge amounts of disease pressures, and lots of stress. And this place was running them into the ground. And what they were producing was basically cask wine. So they weren't really getting paid for it at the end of the day. So they were doing 5 applications of herbicide a year, and they dropped that to 80% in the next 2 to 3 years. They also dropped all their trace element inputs. They dropped all their fertilizer, and they went cold turkey on their synthetic inputs. But what they put in instead was a soil and leaf biostimulants. Their cost reductions per hectare made them one of the most cost-effective vineyards in the North Island, and that was actually a government study that came and had a look at what they were doing. So as a result from doing some of these regenerative soil practices, so they allowed grass to start to grow, and they began mowing underneath the vines. They saw a reduction in the variation between the different blocks. They got rid of any trace element deficiencies. They got rid of pretty much most disease pressures, saw consistent ripening, and they took those grapes from cask to super premium. And I think to do that took about 3 years for them to get to super premium. So that's just an example of we can pull the rug out if we're putting something else in place. So what was missing on this particular operation was microbiology. So very poor microbial functioning, and especially when you're looking at herbicide weeds, your microbiology are totally out of whack. You're probably very bacterially dominated. You are not growing for the crop that you want to grow. These guys were growing they were growing basically for very primitive weeds, primitive grasses, Yeah, instead of going, actually, we need to have very fungal dominated soil systems underneath the vine. So I want to touch a little bit on the New Zealand dairy model, because it's often held up as an example of this is the exemplar of dairy management. And in reality, if you look at the whole picture, not just look at the increase in milk production, over 50 years, the pesticides are up by 3,000%, antibiotics are up by 1,000,000%. Now, that's easy to say that in 50 years because there would have been very low antibiotic use. From last year to this year, it's going up by about 3% a year, despite the herd dropping. New Zealand urea, so nitrogen's up by more than 600% in 25 years, even though we're seeing a decrease or just stable dry matter production. The average lactations which used to be 8 to 10 lactations, are now 2.5. Now you can say that some of those choices to cull your herd might be your choice, or it might be that those animals need to go. But we're also seeing a decrease in fertility, an increased use of antibiotics, and up to 30% lameness in some herds. So obviously there's going to be a lot of range, but that's of real concern. Very low return on investment in New Zealand in terms of dairy farms. And you may have heard about the water situation in New Zealand. Despite fencing off waterways, which is very common practice, which has stopped sedimentation. Oh, I think I'm going to sneeze. So we've reduced a lot of the sedimentation and pea mobility into waterways, except now there's more nitrogen. And then to control weeds in these riparian areas, they come along and herbicide it. Now, if you're using herbicides like glyphosate in their waterways, glyphosate actually increases the amount of dissolved organic phosphorus and is a major contributor to algal blooms. So you don't want to see phosphorus washing off or moving with sediment into waterways at all, and certainly not being sprayed into waterways. So all of this comes back to how we're treating our soil. So I just want to show an example. So this operation, they were part of a Dairy NZ study. They're in Southland at the bottom of New Zealand, and what they found is, as an outcome of shifting to regenerative practices, putting more diversity into the system, and cutting all their NPK, most of their NPK, they saw an increase in pasture quality and resilience, significantly cut their nitrogen, saw more clover turning up in the system, and their dry matter to milk solid feed efficiencies increased. I'm not sure how you measure milk in Ireland. I suspect you might not use milk solids, but anyway. And they maintained production despite doing this with their inputs. So they had been using about 70 units or kilograms per hectare of nitrogen when they started on this program, and about 35 of phosphorus. So they managed to drop most of those inputs right out of the system. So they went down to 20 units in their first year and down to 0 in 2012. But what's really interesting is that their annual production didn't really change. So this is kilograms of milk solid per kilogram of dry matter. So how much their annual production was. So you see there's a slight bit of fluctuation. They did drop cow numbers by about 10 over 2 years. But actually their milk solids per hectare maintained despite that massive drop. Now, what was really interesting out of this study was looking at feed efficiency. So their kilograms of milk solid per day as a percentage. So their Dairy NZ has 100% this is going to be your feed efficiencies. And what they found was through lifting the quality of the grass that you're producing, those feed efficiencies dramatically increased. So what does this look like? This means that you get animals spend more time lying down, chewing their cud. You'll see animals looking a lot more content. And for some producers, it actually means you could lift your carrying capacity, so you could actually run more animals if you wanted to. So they did a study in New Zealand comparing regenerative, biologically managed pastures to conventional. And what they found was the ecosystem services, so that is water quality, greenhouse gases, the milk that you're producing, services like pollination, insect biodiversity. They calculated all of that as a calculation for ecosystem services. And what they found was those poorly managed conventional pastures may have been providing as little as $62 per hectare per year. So that includes flood mitigation, sedimentation, water quality. Like, we really need to be thinking of production in that whole big system. So even the best of the conventional, we're offering maybe $1,500 per hectare per year. Now compare that to the regenerative, which may be providing as much as $6,500 per hectare per year. So we really need to be looking at how do we support farmers that are actually the stopgap in things like flooding, in things like climatic variability. Like, it is the farms that really are the buffer to what's happening in urban areas. And I think the urban community needs to kind of be aware of all of these great things that farms are providing when they are managed well. So I talked about air movement. We really need to be focusing on how well is that soil breathing, because everything else topples out of that. So you can imagine for yourself, if you put your hand over your nose and mouth, we don't last long without breathing, and it's the same in soil systems. So on the left is an integrated pest managed orchard, and on the right is a regeneratively managed. And what you're looking at is it's basically like a little X-ray machine that's taken X-rays of the empty pore spaces. So the white is the pore spaces and the black is the soil. And what they found was in the conventional managed on the left is that when you get heavy rainfall events, that water just washes off. What's making those big burrows are insect pests. So huge amounts of insect pests. The greenhouse gas emissions on the left are much, much higher, whereas the one on the right, if you look, most of it looks like air. And so you find this as biology really start to hum. It's all of those nematodes and the protozoa and the earthworms moving through those systems that are building this huge, big aerated channel, which means there's no limitation to air and water movement. They say that these soils held on to significantly more water. And then what was interesting is the water that came through the back end was cleaner than the water that they put through the top. They then applied 2,4-D, because you're a scientist and that's what you do. The 2,4-D on the left did not break down at all. The 2,4-D on the right, when they measured it, they couldn't find it at all. And they're like, oh, what idiot forgot to put the 2,4-D on, do it again. Same thing. When they measured it, the water that came out the bottom was clean. They broke open those soils and found that microbiology had totally biodegraded that 2,4-D. This is what we need in our soil systems, is these soils that are able to robustly deal with any kind of stresses, even if that's chemical. Because what we're seeing, and it's really interesting here in the States, as I talk about the beautiful smell of soil, I was talking to some cropping guys in Montana, and they were saying, well, it rained the other day and we were really excited and we went outside and all that we could smell was herbicides, because the herbicides are actually coming down in the rainfall in these areas. And if we don't build a system that can actually bioremediate it, we're going to be in some trouble. So 78% of New Zealand dairy farms are significantly compacted, and this was a national study by the government as well. And that photograph is a regenerative farm, so I shouldn't have used that as an example. So compaction, if you think air movement is your main limit to production, we need to be looking at what's happening with compaction, because it's a significant threat to production. Those compacted soils need more nitrogen and they lose more nitrogen. So up to 10 times more is lost from compacted soils, which now means you're on this vicious treadmill if you're going to have to keep putting more in to be able to grow your crop, and on and on and on it goes, and those soils get more and more compacted. All right, we really need to be looking at what's causing that compaction. Is it, and look at the 5 M's, is it a mineral imbalance, microbial imbalance? Is it you? It'll be you. So this case study, what we found was, it's quite interesting. It's a racing stud, but what they'd done is they'd basically leveled the whole property. So it had been deep gullies. So you see where those water lines are moving. Those had been fairly deep gullies that they basically just scraped the soil off in some places and dumped into the gullies. Right, that had implications. When I arrived, what we were seeing were these big rills were starting to develop. There was lots of bare ground, lots of cracking. And in some areas where they'd scraped it off, there was only like a centimetre of topsoil that they'd left on top. And then you get these hard pans forming. And you see the roots just grow directly sideways. Not great. And then we're seeing these kind of flat weeds, nitrogen patches, lots of dandelions and buttercups, and lots of insects. So I'm sure you guys might be able to relate to this. So what we did in the first year is we actually got an aerator out there and we applied compost. They had been dumping their waste out of the barns, out of the racing barns, which is just crazy. It was costing them like tens of thousands of dollars. And I was like, how about we just make compost instead? So we started to make compost that wasn't applied in year 1. We did a foliar application with a fish hydrolysate and entomopathogenic fungi. So these are organisms that we can use to control pest insects. So you can see in that hand is a clover root weevil and a black beetle. Now these, and there were ticks also on the livestock. So the entomopathogenic fungi, there's some called Metarhizium or Bovaria. We actually mixed that with an oil and applied it along the horses' top lines to get rid of the ticks because they had major problems with ticks. We also did a fairly substantial solid program, and for a racing, like these guys are the leading Group 1 winners, I believe, in the Southern Hemisphere. So they are a very successful operation. So I had a bit of an unlimited budget, which was a lot of fun. So we put quite a lot of nutrients on. I'm not saying that you do this, and I'm not saying it's a prescription, but there was a lot that went into this program. And that's the compost that we started to make. It's beautiful. All right, so this is what it looked like when we started. About 18 months into the program, this is what we started to see, is all this mixing. So worms starting to come up and break up that very sharp pan. So seeing worms actually moving through that clay. Oh man, you can't see the picture. Oh, it's so rough. Sorry about that. And within 22 months, we actually built an inch of soil. So basically we were building a millimeter of soil every month. Just let that sink in, a millimeter of soil every month. So we did something fairly extraordinary, and I'm not saying that it was affordable, but it is possible to build soil incredibly quickly. Now, we couldn't use cover crops on this operation because they wanted it to look like every other bog standard bloodstock operation, which just looks like a golf course. So yeah, we did sneak a little bit of diversity in there, but really it's how do we do that with minerals and microbiology. As a result, we doubled that brick, so plant photosynthesis. We dropped their sodic levels back, so they had been irrigating with brine, which no one had realized. And so we managed to drop that back to levels that they'd had about 8 years earlier. We got 95% insect control in the soil and on the plants and also in animals. And we saw a significant change in animal behavior, which was kind of neat. So the jockeys reported how the horses went so much better. They weren't shying. They weren't as anxious because they're starting to get complete nutrition in their pastures. So I'm just aware of the time. I think I've got 4 minutes. 2 minutes. So I'm just going to skip through this weed stuff, and I really recommend that you get hold of my book, and it has a whole chapter there about reading your weeds and thinking about weeds and what they're trying to tell you. Just get past that. So really, we need to be looking at how do we address compaction. Now, that could be done with cover crops. What's happening with waterlogging? It's all about microbiology and having gas diffusion. We need to have these well aggregated soils, and it is absolutely key to how we get this biological plant communication, the biological signals, and getting that system open. And there is one of the parts of the greenhouse gas discussion, methane discussions, all of that is, it all comes down to having well-functioning soils. So if you already are on a regenerative program, I want you to consider that what works this year, you still need to be monitoring, and whatever that looks like. You don't need to do soil tests every year, but you need to know, am I heading forwards or backwards? And what worked well this year might not work next year, right? Because we're working with biological systems. We need to be adaptive, and we need to always be learning. Like I say things sometimes, and this is the problem with writing a book, is you've put it down like some kind of immovable line, and actually what you find is you keep learning, and you're like, oh, but we need these lines. So if I can just thank you for tuning in, and I'd love the opportunity to hear your questions and have a bit more of a discussion. Thank you.
Will, we're not hearing you actually.
Okay.
Okay, Will, I think we're back, are we? No, we're gone again.
Okay, Sean, keep going there.
Okay,
I
well,
thought we were well with technology.
yeah. I think we've lost Will for a few minutes, but we've loads of questions, Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can just, could you expand? My first question is anonymous, but could you expand on spraying molasses to nudge land away from growing woody plants like gorse?
Very good. So yeah, if we have, often think of gorse as being like a real disturbance indicator, and it's really working hard to rehabilitate and get your nitrogen cycles working. But with a lot of our other woody weeds, like I imagine you guys get bracken. You got bracken? Yeah, you do. I think you sent it to New Zealand. Thank you. When we're seeing that woody type encroachment, what you've got is soil that I call sleepy or constipated. So it means that these soils are starting to fall asleep. You know, anything with spikes is really trying to keep you off the ground too. So thinking about gorse, it's almost saying like this system needs time to repair. But if you're wanting to put that back into pasture, then by applying molasses, what we're doing is we're waking up the bacterial component, and basically enlivening those soils. Now, you don't want to use too much and you don't want to do it too often, but it is something that we see can be very helpful with those woody weeds. I do find with gorse that once it's tall and it's standing, then you're going to need some kind of interruption. So potentially mower mulching. My father had this cool machine recently, and it was all like remotely controlled, and it was going down these massive slopes and just mower mulching like 2.5, 3 meter high gorse and woolly nightshade and all sorts of stuff. And now after he did that and he mulched it, we put on some molasses and fish, and the pasture looks beautiful now.
Okay, and that's great. And I think we're back with you, Will.
Can you hear me all right now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah.
Because it started raining here, the joy of rural communications. Nicole, a question from EG. Why did you put serpentine on the racing stud? Is it remineral?
Yeah, on that case, that was one of our cheapest sources of magnesium. So these guys, when we're looking at like your calcium to magnesium ratios, they had pretty much very, very low magnesium in the system at all. Now, we can allow systems to reboot. Like, you don't have to necessarily put solid mineral on, but for us, it enabled us to fast track.
Okay, so is tackling the minerals the key to unlocking soil?
Remember the 5M. So do you have a mineral problem? Is it a microbial problem? Is it organic matter? So no. In some cases, that might be something that you want to look at. On some soils, it might be really, really high in magnesium, let's say, then that can make soils like super tight. And now those soils have challenges in breathing. And even putting in cover crops, we still find those soils stay quite concreted. And sometimes you'll see like tillage radish will just grow straight up out of the ground. And so what we do is when we're seeding, we'll actually put like a granulated or a liquid gypsum down with it, and just enough, like we're talking about like 30 kilos a hectare, just enough to flocculate or open around where the roots are so that the roots can penetrate, and now they can start driving what builds soil, because it's those roots and microbiological relationships that are what are building aggregation. You can't go and buy aggregation in a bag. Like, it's really microbiology that are building that. And so if it is something like a mineral imbalance that's slowing that system down, if we start to address it and allow the plant to get going, now you're rocking.
Okay. And anonymous question: Can you actually build topsoil, say adding height above rock, or is it transforming subsoils under topsoil?
Can you build it on top of rock? Yes, but you're going to need to be adding some kind of organic materials in order to do that. Like, you need some kind of substrate. So you're just trying to build on top of rocks. And I know people, and I think even, I think Joel Salatin talks about building from shale. You know, they basically just put round bales and bale grazed and compost and organic material or chickens or whatever, but you're going to need to, really try and fast track it from that side of things. The microbiology in plant roots have some pretty powerful acids to etch away and really making sure you have mycorrhizal functioning well in that system. Yeah. It's not going to be super quick though, right? Building topsoil on top of rocks, but yeah.
A question that you talked about one of the issues for New Zealand and the big dairy farming areas. I know from farmers in New Zealand through social media, they're feeling of those regulations. A lot of them are struggling with it. Do you think that that at the same time they can see them, and government policy is obviously pushing them in that direction?
Yeah, and I think the way that the government is going about it is quite revolting, really. To and it was interesting. We actually had one of the ministers come to a meeting by Zoom recently, and what she said was, "I never believed in regulation. I didn't believe that we would have to do that, but it's the farmers' fault for not listening, basically. We've been signaling this for like 20 years and no one's done anything about it. So therefore it's your fault. And now we're going to make you." And I was so disappointed in that, because the failure in the system has really been around education and empowering farmers and showing them other ways to do things like regenerative, so that they just don't need all those inputs. But under the current model and where they get their information from right now, they're told if you drop your nitrogen, your yield's going to drop and you're going to be bankrupt. And yeah, I think it's really disgusting. And now, I mean, I think I was talking to a farmer recently and he wanted to direct drill a crop, and he's like, I have to fill out a form to do that, and I think you guys in Europe are a lot more used to the probably regulations and having to fill things in, but it becomes so anti-innovation. It just takes the joy out of farming if you end up spending most of your time doing paperwork. So we are working on some pretty cool projects that will involve the New Zealand government to stop that kind of knee-jerk reaction to something and go, all right, how do we redesign systems? How do we transform them? And there's so many exciting projects coming out of New Zealand that you're going to hear about in the next year, that are really designed to how do you build soil health? How do you reduce inputs? How do you really look after animal health? And the research is coming in behind us now. It's not like there's nothing to back this up. There's so much stuff in the literature just in the last year to really support doing things like seed treatments or doing compost extracts or adaptive grazing. We know that this works now. We just need to support farmers.
Question from Kevin Brady. We are in a New Zealand style dairy system. What is the first steps to make the change and still protect farm output? Again, it's going to come down to this is all context specific. And I often find people are kind of trying to find, well, what's the one answer? And there isn't one. But some of the best things you can do is really look at what am I doing right now that might be harming microbiology or harming soil. So things like seed treatments. If you're using neonicotinoids, that's your number one thing that's got to be removed from the system. If you're using high soluble P, is there another form of P that you could use? If you're using nitrogen, which you probably are, can you put a carbon form with that to help buffer that? If you're just in a ryegrass clover blend, how can we really increase species diversity into that? Because, that complex root architecture, diversity for animals, we're seeing stuff that's coming out and should be published in the next few months to show that the ryegrass and clover mix of just feeding animals on that raises their cortisol levels. Those animals are actually intrinsically incredibly stressed. It's like if all you got to eat for the rest of your life was broccoli, you're not going to do all that well. And so I think we're going to see more questions around that. The lack of diversity in monocultures is actually an animal welfare concern. So I think get some diversity into your sward, whatever that looks like. I absolutely love chicory and plantain, and I will chuck them with everything. But some of our older grasses that people kind of went off, I think there is value for them, especially when you're looking at building something for animals to tread on, building that density of root system so that we don't pug. Do you call it pugging in Ireland? Pug your fields with the cows? Treading damage? We call it pugging. Not in Wales. Is that what you call it in Ireland, Sean?
Oh, poaching. I think that's poaching, is it?
Porchin.
Poaching.
Porchin. All right, let's try that. You have to spell it for me. Yeah, so, a big part of that is that we don't have root density, and I'm saying this without ever being to Ireland, but I suspect you guys probably have significant pasture pests. So really taking a look at, are your roots being chewed off? Are you seeing damage in legumes? Have you got nodules? All of that stuff, because those insects could actually be putting a drag on your system. And that's where some of these biocontrols can actually just really get people shifting forward. I have to say, I think that for most of our dairy clients, our first step is actually running an aerator over the system, because you don't have to lose a whole lot of pasture production by doing that in autumn. And maybe you will have to just take some of the fields out of your grazing to do that, depending on, like, if you can use an aerator that doesn't do a huge amount of above ground damage, but just to get air moving, and now address your management, because your management's probably been what's causing that compaction. So we've got to kind of take a step back and go, all right, what was I doing that was causing that, and where to start? But we do find just a simple ag like running an aerator can significantly increase pasture production. So that makes our clients happy.
John D has a question here about stocking rates. What stocking rates are regenerative dairy farms in New Zealand running, and are they feeding much supplement?
No, they're not feeding supplement, and some of them philosophically, like they might be doing silage, baleage, hay, potentially, but not a lot of PKE. So palm kernel is pretty common, unfortunately, in New Zealand, which has also been regulated. You're only allowed to do, is it 2 kilos per head per day? And everyone freaked out, and I'm like, 2 kilos, that's an awful lot of PKE. Anyway, and the stocking rate, I think it's kind of interesting, because I think potentially you can maintain that stocking rate, and some do, some temporarily drop numbers while they're allowing, because if you're changing your grazing rounds and rotations, then you've got to kind of mess with how your grazing system's been working. New Zealand is a brilliant rotational overgrazers. So don't let them tell you that like they're the best holistic grazers, because rotational overgrazing is not holistic or adaptive grazing, right? So if you're shifting some of your grazing patterns, then potentially you might look at where am I going to get some excess feed if I'm lengthening my rotation. But yeah, I'd say most of the guys we deal with, if they do drop numbers a little bit, they're still maintaining production. So they end up getting more production per cow. And I think that's what we need to be looking at, is production per cow, animal health, not having to deal with all the mastitis and the foot problems and the stress and the ketosis or whatever. That's where some of our biggest gains is by lifting animal health. Yeah, and I do feel like New Zealand, a lot of I'm going to get shot after I do this talk, me down with pitchforks, is that I think a lot of places are overstocked anyway. So I actually think that dropping numbers a little bit and focusing on production per animal is a better way to go.
Okay. You talked a bit about grazing patterns there. What about, Jamie wants to know, what about grass varieties in dairy pastures? And does anything work better than the mainly standard ryegrass lays?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, especially in the Irish scene, I think you definitely want to see more diversity into the system. So multi-species. I think on average, most of the regenerative guys are probably doing 12 to 16 species in their dairy mixes. And I mean, that's the stuff that really drives milk production. And then you've got more resilience through the season, because you've got something that's going to work better in summer than what will work better in the middle of winter. And seeing some of these sort of higher winter active crops. I mean, we don't do a lot of indoor housing like I imagine is happening in Ireland. So, treating damage, pugging is just huge. And so, yeah, again, having diverse root architecture is vital.
Okay. Question from
very good questions.
Yeah, another good one here from Jack Healy. What were the main changes the DNZ Fry Dairy Farm made to convert to regenerative agriculture?
It was a two-pronged approach. So they addressed species diversity, and they dropped their NPK and put in a commercial biological product that is full of biological metabolites as well as concentrated trace elements. So they kind of went from all of those inputs to about 10 liters of a biological stimulant with a bit of trace elements. And then they still put in some guano. Like they didn't totally drop their P. There was still a little bit of guano in there, and they did put some potassium in their first year. But yeah, overall, I mean, being able to drop your nitrogen like that and not see a decline in yield, but see an increase in feed efficiency, I think it's fantastic.
Sean, have you got any questions?
Yeah, I have another few following on from the same theme. I think you struck a chord, Nicole. We'll have to get you over to talk to dairy farmers in Ireland at some stage.
No pitchforks. I'm pitchforks.
Can you, Jack Healy wants to know, and I suppose you've kind of almost answered this anyway, is can you speak about maintaining diversity in a dairy sward without having to constantly reseed every year? I think that's really important, because what you see is a lot of guys buy mixes now that are pre-mixed and stuff like that, but a lot of the different non-grasses seem to go after year 3, year 4, and is that a management issue as much as anything else?
There's probably 3 or 4 parts to that, really. So management is part of it. So if you are running something like a chicory, they're on a totally different grazing rotation than the rye and clover, and so we're often thinking, who am I managing for? And so you're really looking at managing those, because if you do crown damage on the chicory, it's just gone. And so persistence, some of these clovers as well, people are having problems. I've got some friends that have run chicory in their dairy farm for 8 years now. So and so the other part might be, where are we getting our seeds from, and what's on those seeds? Have they been treated? And then the other thing is, if you're not seeing persistence, then you're not farming for those pasture species. So really look at what's happening biologically, and what you'll find is most of these soils are very bacterial dominated, because everything we do in dairy farm systems is feed bacteria. So we put urea on that feeds bacteria, urine and manure, very bacterial boost, and especially if you're in housing and you're putting, let's say, not totally composted manure on. I'm sure no one does that. That's just feeding bacteria. And then ryegrass and clover, they just feed bacteria. And so we keep these systems really bacterial dominated, which is perfect for weeds, and it's not good for some of our more advanced grass species that really are the ones that pump milk or meat production. So we got to really think about what management practices I'm using, because the persistence issue is telling you that you're farming for the wrong species.
Oh, wow, okay. In order to regenerate, this is an anonymous question, in order to regenerate soils in 1 year, would you recommend multiple annual crops in a year or perennials, e.g. grass?
I think what you'll find is a lot of people trying to put perennials straight into the system. You don't get very good performance or persistence, and you get a lot of gaps in the system, because back to this bacterial thing is, right now your soils really favor those annuals. I'm not a big fan of like people who come in with cover crops and do multiple cover crops and spray them out in between. Like, it just seems like crazy talk, and we want diversity into the system. So yeah, I don't see the dollar value in doing multiple annuals in a year. Like, I think you really need to look at some of the stuff I've touched on in terms of these multiple things that are going to help build a soil. But what I am seeing, it seems to be a trend, is it can be more challenging to get perennials straight out of the gate. So you're better to do 1 or 2 years of an annual, start to move it towards a more balanced biological system, and then your perennials are going to get going. I mean, we've just been dealing, because I've got consultants or coaches that work with me in Australia, and we're just seeing massive cover crop failure. And when you go and look at who's successful, they are the ones that have really tried to prime that system, move it towards a more fungal to bacteria ratio, and then the perennials are going really well.
And how can you manage that, would say, in that if you're a dairy farmer and you want to get mixed diversity in the seeds, or mixed diversity in the fields, how do you manage if it's a bad time of the year to graze at one time and not the other, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's tricky, especially with long, cool seasons where grasses aren't necessarily fully recovering before you're coming back in. And this is where potentially we do need to have other feed resources so that you're not kind of sacrificing your whole property. Yeah, and I think that is the benefit of indoor housing. And I think we're going to see more indoor housing in New Zealand because of the impacts that we're having through having to make decisions because you haven't got any other options, you know. And I think being able to grow good quality silage potentially for dairy farms is an option. And I mean, being able to get adequate plant recovery in dairy farm systems is a challenge without, you know, dropping your herd or buying more land. Yeah, and that's where those diverse species really come into their own.
Okay, and one last question is you mentioned that the stud farm, that they went a very different approach. They went almost for a golf course look, which many dairy farmers in Ireland, funny enough, would have that short grass approach. Was that quicker to achieve what you wanted to achieve with the inputs, or would a system like cover crops have achieved that just at the same time period and a lot cheaper?
I don't think cover crops would have achieved that because they're growing into clay, so they would have just grown sideways. So we'd see those root systems growing sideways. I think we can achieve similar goals with the cover crops. We did that really fast. We did it really fast. And I've seen some super cool stuff with cover crops building soil pretty quick, but it's challenging when you have an anaerobic layer. And these guys had, like I said, they were irrigating with brine, so they started to have more sodic concerns. The other thing I want to kind of touch on is around this quality issue, is that people are scared about lengthening rounds because you lose quality. And that's true in a conventional system, but it's not true in a regenerative biological system. And the reason for that is what drives quality is diverse microbiology. It is getting fungi in the system because they are what mobilizes things like calcium. And if you have adequate calcium in the system, they start to form what we call the calcium pectins. And that is your higher quality. And so the grass might look the same, but actually what the animal's experience is, which is coming down to your relative feed values or your feed efficiencies, and your like neutral detergent fibers, that we see the fibers drop even though the pasture is really tall. So I work with a lot of tall grass grazing dairy farmers, right, that will have, you know, they're coming into 40, 50 centimeters of grass, which in the past they wouldn't have got the milk production from, and now they're finding that they are, because they've changed that biological component. Now, if they didn't do that, then they'd be seeing drops of production and they wouldn't be very profitable. So we need to sometimes question some of the paradigms we have around why do we keep dairy farms looking like a golf course.
Just one question that I had, if I can jump in for a section. When you mentioned in your presentation that going outside after the rain and being able to smell herbicide, which sounds horrific. What did the farmers say about that? Did they realise that there's something not right, but they're not quite sure how to change things? Is that the feeling?
Yeah, what we're seeing is pretty good shifts in uptake, and I think what Gabe Brown has done for the world is just revolutionary, really, in terms of people seeing, hey, there are things that we can do in some of these environments. And one of the challenges is that some of these guys in these areas are trying to grow organic export crops, so wheat or barley or kamut or whatever, and they can't get it into the EU because of the amount of herbicides in it, because it's in the rain and in the dust. And this is part of what we need to be thinking about, is do we have a phylosphere full of microbiology that can actually break down those residues so that you can still grow a nil residue crop even if it's coming down in the rain. And I think a study recently in the US showed that 90% of waterways and rainfall has glyphosate in it. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty shocking.
It is.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we really need to be looking after our own gut system, our own health, and our soil's health in order to be able to kind of weather this storm.
Sean, how are we doing for time?
I think we're long over, but it was such an interesting talk. And actually, it's I think it's your another person from your neck of the woods is coming on next, if I'm correct.
Right.
Yeah, and so I'm sure he's patiently waiting to see. But I think he probably would agree with everything Nicole has said. But I just want to say, Nicole, some of the stuff you've come out with there this evening is just absolutely revolutionary. It's all the stuff we didn't know. So I think we'll definitely be having you on appearing in a field in Ireland as soon as we can.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah.
That would make my heart sing. Thank you so much. So Hamish Belsky, he's coming up?
Yes.
Yeah. No, what he's doing is absolutely fantastic. So if I can stay on, I'd like to stay on. And
Absolutely.
Just from a personal point of view, I very much enjoyed at the beginning of your talk you saying that being uncertain and feeling out of your comfort zone is a good thing, because I feel like that a lot. So that was encouraging.
we all do. It's a cycle. I go from feeling like I know lots to I know nothing some days.
Yeah.
You should have
in one
seen me
day.
on Monday. So we're going to be back in 2 minutes.